Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center's Out in Academia event. My name is Alex Long, and I am a program associate with the Science and Technology Innovation Program and the manager of the LGBTQI plus Employee Resource Group, or ERG, that was started by the Diversity and Inclusion Council about late last year in 2020. I'm so excited to have everyone here today and our incredible panel. Today, we're going to be having a more meta discussion than we might be used to for Wilson Center programming. And by that, I mean, we as an evidence-based policy institution and think tank really rely on the facts and the figures and the analyses of academics, universities, and journals to kind of inform what we put out as policy recommendations. And we take a lot of pride in contextualizing and synthesizing all of that data into easy to understand directives and other analyses. But what I want to address today is how those practices can create a bottleneck, because who is able to produce those facts, who's able to produce those figures, who's able to provide the evidence that is the basis for our policy recommendations, and who's being left out of that conversation, who's being boxed out of the discussion, and who's not making it into those higher echelons of academia, of these research institutions, of non-government organizations. And the panel that we have assembled today are all people who have excelled in their respective careers, but there are so many people who are a part of the LGBTQI plus community who have not been so lucky. So today we're going to interrogate how hard it is and the obstacles that are in place for queer individuals to excel in these spaces and excel in an academic ecosystem, which, I'll be honest, gets a very positive view from the public as being progressive, especially on these issues. But that's not necessarily always the case. And I mean, speaking personally, my view from being out in academia, as this panel talks about, is from my experience having a mentor in college who was queer. And I was too, but I was not out. But hearing his stories is what inspired me to do the work that I'm doing today, and especially this panel. So Dr. Dessa, if you're watching, thank you so much. Your advice means the world. So now enough about me, and we will get to our amazing panelists. Alexander Chee, Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth College. Dr. Chloe Schwenke, President of the Center for Values and International Development, and Dr. Bonnie Morris, Lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley in the Department of History. I'm going to read their incredibly impressive bios, and then they're going to give a 7 to 10 minute conversation or speech about their experience being out in academia, and then all these other policy sectors that they intersect with. And then we will go into a discussion and a Q&A with the audience if the time allows. For the Q&A with the audience, please tweet at #PrideAtWilson. And then if you do not have a Twitter or would rather just email, please email Sarah Akbar at wilsoncenter.org. That's SARA.Akbar, AKBAR, at wilsoncenter.org. And again, Sarah, I know you're listening. Thank you so much for all of your help with this. I'm just so pleased that we were able to have this discussion. So first up is Alexander Chee. Alexander Chee is the best-selling author of the novels Edinburgh and the Queen of the Night and the essay collection How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, all from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, a contributing editor to the New Republic and an editor at large at VQR. His essays and stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, T Magazine, the Sewanee Review, and the 2016 and 19 Best American Essays. He is a 2021 United States Artist Fellow, a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction, and the recipient of the Whitting Award, an NEA Fellowship, an MCCA Fellowship, and the Randy Schultz Prize in Gay Nonfiction, the Paul Engel Prize, the Lambda Editor's Choice Prize, and residency fellowships from the McDowell County, the VCCA, the Ledig House, the Civitella Ranieri, and Amtrak. He teaches as an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. And Alex, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction. It's nice to be here. Nice to be with my esteemed panelists. And thank you to the Wilson Center for putting this together and making this opportunity happen. As I was thinking about what I would say, I thought about something that I came across from the writer Kiese Lehman, who is a writer and a friend that I admire a great deal. And he said, unacknowledged scars accumulated in battles won often hurt more than battles lost. He was talking about it in relationship to the way success for marginalized people can be used also as a way to mask the harm that's been done. And so I thought I would start that way, just as a way of saying that, like, just because I've accomplished what I've accomplished doesn't mean that there were no problems along the way, and that there aren't even problems now. And my success should not be taken as any sign that any of those barriers or obstacles are gone. I think of, the way I started was, like many people, especially I think for creative writers, I taught at a kind of adjunct level / visiting writer level for decades before I got this job. So I arrived at Dartmouth in 2016. This was my first tenure track job. I started teaching in 1996 at the Gotham Writers Workshop in New York City. Those classes were usually, I think, if I remember correctly, something like 10 weeks, and you were paid $950. And I called them the MASH unit of creative writing because you could not turn anyone away. Whoever signed up for the class was in the class. There was no rejection of them. From there, I gradually moved first to the new school, which paid a little bit better, and it was a semester-length term. And then by 2002, I was invited to return to my alma mater as a visiting writer, teaching 2 workshops a year. And those were compensated at a level that made me feel suddenly very rich, even though now I look back and I question my judgment in these matters. I don't know whether or not my being out was a problem or not in terms of the decision that was made. I think in many ways it may have been more of a problem that I was an alum at Wesleyan, in a sense. But it is also not lost on me that at the time that I arrived there, there were a number of out gay men on the faculty who I had become friends with, and I watched as their tenure decisions were denied. And a writing job came up there. That was then, I was invited to apply for it, and I did not apply. And that was part of the reason. It just didn't seem safe. I think part of what you are doing as a scholar when you're looking for the place that you will eventually find tenure, should you find tenure, is you're looking for a place that will take care of your career and your future. And you're looking for the ways that they will do that. And part of that is visible in the way that they take care of the careers of people who are like you, your peers, as it were. I don't know if I regret not applying for that job. It's hard to make those decisions. I think of something that the filmmaker Park Chan-wook said when I interviewed him for a profile I wrote of him in 2017. We were talking about the blacklist in Korea that had been discovered, a blacklist of artists that the government had created. And I was asking him whether he felt he'd been affected by it. And he said, you never know what you didn't get, or you almost never know what you didn't get because of it. I think of reports that I got back from certain magazines by former students of mine who went on to intern and work at those magazines, these mainstream magazines, and they would say, oh, your name came up in an editorial meeting, but they said you were too gay to write for the magazine. I don't think anyone says it anymore, but they might. I don't know. But that was one of those moments when I did get to know what was being said. And I did get to know what I didn't get because of it. Where at this particular men's magazine, they had spent so much time trying to avoid being seen as gay that they had instituted this kind of protectorate around who was published there. You also become a sort of a mix of hyper visible and invisible as a member of the faculty, where in class, if I say something like my husband, for example, I've outed myself effectively. And even though it is legal for me to marry, attitudes about sexuality and sexual identity are still, as we know, shall we say, asymmetrical in terms of the level of acceptance that we have. And so it's something that I've always thought about. I remember when I was a graduate student at Iowa in the University of Iowa Rhetoric program, which is to say I was teaching in that program. I was there for the writer's workshop. I made a decision not to be out to my students as a graduate student. And that was the same fall that Tina Brandon was killed. And it was, did I say there? Brandon Tina, sorry. The name dyslexia. The case made national headlines, but it also, I just remember sitting at a bagel shop, reading the article in the paper, and thinking about whether I had made a terrible mistake or not, whether I should talk about it or not. It was a difficult choice that I had made. I didn't know how it would be received by my students, to be out to them in this small college town that seemed so liberal in certain ways. Like when I paid a ticket at the police station, I remember there was a basket of red ribbons for AIDS awareness. And the sort of seeing that, being in movie theaters surrounded by straight couples weeping while I watched Philadelphia, it suggested that it wouldn't be an issue, but that didn't mean it wouldn't be. And it also, as a graduate student, I think I already suspected that I would not have the backing of the administration should anything become a problem, And that's the other thing too that happens, is that so often because of the way this discrimination against us works in academia, we are often in adjunct roles. We are often in visiting writer roles. We are often lecturers without tenure. And so we don't have any protections usually should someone complain in the same way that we might if we were tenured or tenure track. I think you might not know, for example, that there's such a thing as an ombudsperson at your particular institution, or how they might help you. You might not have a chair who is willing to sit down with you and listen to whatever you're facing and give advice. So I think, you know, the kinds of problems that I've had, you know, after that moment, I decided that I would be out to my students, even though I knew it would be a problem, but that going forward as a teacher, that it was my obligation. It was interesting to me in that rhetoric class that some of my students chose to write about the Brandon Tina case, even though I had not suggested it in any way. And that was a moment where I felt proud of them, even though I was as ashamed at myself. I think, you know, these are the way that it works later on in your life is almost always as a kind of background that you can sometimes perceive and sometimes not perceive. And it's hard to know whether it is something to take personally or whether it's not personal, because the problem is that discrimination always feels personal to you, even if it is systemic and not personal to you in another sense. So like, you know, am I getting invited to a senior colleague's home for dinner? Do I have a mentor in the institution to speak of? Do my colleagues get together for drinks and just somehow forget to invite me? You know, all these kinds of things are the things where you're like, is it because I'm gay or not? Is it because I'm queer or not? You know, but those are the places where, you know, so much of the information that you need is shared. That's the problem, is that it's not just about something personal. You know, it was shocking to me to be in some conversations recently with colleagues and to find some very asymmetrical information sharing about things that I thought were basic. And that's become something that, you know, my department is now working on. And that seems more systemic, more than about queerness per se, but it becomes a place where, you know, if someone's not comfortable having you over to their home, for example, where they would then tell you all these things that they might tell you, then you don't ever get told. So something has to be done to counter that. And that's really what it feels, certainly it's not the same as like a student painting graffiti on your car. It's not the same as being assaulted as you cross campus. Of course not. But the human cost to you is something that ends up getting measured on your CV in a way that you can never really explain. I'll stop there. I've talked too long. Sorry.
Truly no apologies at all. And thank you so much for sharing that. You took exactly the amount of time that you should. And I mean, I think that you put it really incredibly, Alex, just the amount of inner machinations that go on approaching every decision or everything that you don't get, and how much more thought has to go into every move, just because we do know how evil people can be. And I really appreciate it. So next, thank you so much. So next we have Dr. Chloe Schwenke. Dr. Schwenke is president and founder of the Center for Values and International Development based in Washington, D.C. She has lived and worked in sub-Saharan Africa for more than a decade, and her career includes international development project experience in over 40 countries. She also served under President Obama as the first openly transgender political appointee in the federal foreign affairs agencies, where she was active on LGBTI human rights and development issues globally. Later, she was vice president at Freedom House, where she led the Dignity for All program to support LGBTI human rights defenders around the world. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Chloe Schwenke. Chloe, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, co-panelists. Thank you, Wilson Center, for hosting us. This is really a wonderful honor, and it's so good to see Pride Month actually including trans people. It's hard for us to get our voices heard. There are not that many of us. We were sort of tasked with the challenge of encapsulating our career in just a couple of minutes, which is challenging enough for a trans person when you just have so much to say about being a trans person and what that transition was about. But I can roughly define my career in terms of two streams, one of which is teaching, the academic one, and I've been an adjunct professor, goodness, since 2001, so that's 20 years. But coinciding with that, I've been very active as a development practitioner and human rights activist. So those two things, of course, have fed each other and have been really instructive to each other. One of the best things about being an adjunct teacher is it forces you to stay up with the literature, with what other people are thinking, and particularly what younger people are thinking. So that's been hugely instructive to the work that I do in the field, as it were. So that's been really good. If I were to try to summarize my academic experience from a trans perspective, it really has to do with, when I came out, when I transitioned. And it's kind of coming out as an obvious thing. Suddenly you're a woman, you're standing up in front of people publicly as a woman. That for me happened in 2008. And I had already been teaching for 8 years at Johns Hopkins, the School for Advanced International Studies, and I'd done a year as a Fulbright professor in Uganda at Makerere University, which was an amazing experience. I came back, I wrote to Georgetown, where I was teaching at that point as an adjunct, and said, hey, it's not Stephen anymore, it's Chloe. And to their credit, and I think it meant a lot to me, is they were not only accepting and had no problem administratively about it, they were eloquent in their support. They really could not have been more much in solidarity with me and backing me up at a time when any trans person, I think, would feel incredibly vulnerable at that sort of first few years of starting that transition. Georgetown was there, and so was University of Maryland, and those are the School of Public Policy in both cases, both universities, are where I have found my adjunct home, as it were, for the last 20 years. And I've been teaching, roughly about the same amount in each of those universities. Both of them were very forthright and full-throated in their advocacy and support for who I am and what my authentic gender identity is. And that's been meaningful to me. It's important. It doesn't quite, make it easier to still stand in front of that students for the first time and hope that my voice can reach everyone, because I was, one of the hardest things for trans women is to deal with our voices. And for me, many, many months of voice therapy, but it's still hard. And it's still hard, particularly at volume, to project a voice. That's, when it's something as direct as your own voice in a teaching mode is you're feeling insecure about that. It's tough. It's really tough. I also really, you worry about how you're going to be perceived by students. Do they know that I'm a trans woman, or am I just Chloe? I worried about that lots more than the students ever did. The students, I don't know for that first year whether they knew or not, because I didn't tell them. After that, I was just upfront and told them. I mean, it was such an important part of my teaching that I wanted to make sure that whole range of experiences, having been in nail space for so long, and then coming at the world as a new woman in a really important way, was important too. I don't have time to talk across the 40 plus countries of where I worked, except to say that a lot of that work was as a human rights activist and in the context of human rights, which has been important in helping me to articulate what's really driving a lot of what I'm about now, and why I set up the Center for Values, trying to bring in notions of what we don't talk about much in development: care, altruism, connection, human dignity itself, the conversations that are outside the political economy equation that's totally dominant right now, international relief and development. The fact that most people in international relief and development are there because they care, and their institutions do not give them a space to have that conversation. A few, however, we're talking about in academia. Let me just share a few observations about what it's like to be a trans woman from my own personal experience at both Maryland and at Georgetown. But even sort of more structural than that, there aren't very many trans professors at any level. And that's partly, I'm sure, some degree in bias in selection. But I think even more essentially than that, it's an indication of how hard it is for trans people to have a life where those opportunities are available to them to be able to acquire that level of education and accomplishment to even be in the running. So when you're looking at discrimination against trans people, it starts when we're 6 or 7. And that's where we need to think about how we're going to find the academics of the future, is to get it right from the beginning, to find ways to not have us excluded from schools, from families, from all of that stuff that's thrown at us as young people, as we try in our own voice to say, this is who I am. So there aren't that many of us. I think it's a systemic issue. Also, in so much of the work that we do is related to research in any field of academia. There's almost no good, solid research on trans issues. There's so few of us. It's nobody's bothered to spend the money to do that kind of research. There's anecdotal, of course, but we're dealing with a real gap in the research background that we're able to speak to and access in our work. Our voices, even within academia, are rarely heard. Lots of people are happy to speak for us. And so it's not just the fact that there are a few of us, it's just that people don't even bother to ask and say, we're having this opportunity, can you come and talk? Getting our voices heard is really important. It's happening more now, but that's a recent phenomenon. It's been really a struggle to get any kind of platform to say, here's what it's like. Even understanding what trans issues are about. We get classified as gay all the time. Other colleagues in academia think that we're gay. There's nothing against being gay, but that's not what defines us. It's about our identity. It's about who we are. And the relationship side and all of that has its place, but that's not our defining issue. And even amongst well-educated academics, you'd be amazed at how little of that is understood. Even within, in my case, as a trans woman, but it would apply to trans men too, you would think we'd find natural allies in gender studies departments. There are, but we're also seeing some really strong, often vitriolic pushback from what are now known as TERFs, not TERFs, but TERFs, trans excluding radical feminists, who will have nothing to do with us. They basically exclude us as women. And their voices are strong. They're very few in number, but punching way above their weight in terms of pushing people like me out of being treated as a decent human being, much less as a transgender woman. Most of the space that I work in as an ethicist, which is what I'm trained in academia, is challenged by the fact that we rely, when we approach anything to do with public policy, we're kind of only talking about human rights. There's a much deeper palette of moral theories and approaches that would do much better on issues that have to do with trans identity than human rights alone can do. And we're also dealing with a very kind of narrow slice of what of human rights are. We're only dealing with political and civil human rights, and mostly on a treaty and law basis. Where's the conversation about human dignity? We need that capabilities approach kind of conversation. We need that Kantian ethics, human dignity conversation. It's not there. And last but not least, we're only beginning to talk about gender identity. We have a whole group of people rising up now that are defining themselves as being non-binary. And God bless them. I mean, I think it takes such courage. We're not even beginning to get prepared for them. They're just largely still ignored. They are not transgender. Most of them would not define themselves that way. They're something different. We got to learn to make space for them as well. And we need to have that conversation about the one thing that brings all of us together in any of these permutations, and that is the human dignity conversation itself. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chloe. And I mean, I hear you loud and clear. And I'm just so glad that we're able to have you on this panel to provide that perspective. So thank you again. All right, next up is Dr. Bonnie Morris. Dr. Bonnie Morris is a women's history lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, a finalist for the 2020 Excellence in Teaching Prize, and a nationally recognized expert on the role of women's music and culture. The author of 19 books, she has devoted more than 30 years to documenting the women's music movement, first publishing Eden Built by Eves, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and more recently, The Disappearing Elle and the Feminist Revolution. Her research on women's music, Olivia Records, and American lesbian culture will one day be housed in the Radcliffe Institute Schlesinger Library. In recent years, Dr. Morris won a DC Arts and Humanities grant and a writing residency in Wales, organized the first ever exhibit on the women's music movement at the Library of Congress, arranged for Olivia albums to be a part of the Smithsonian, received the Ruth Rowan Believer Award from the National Women's Music Festival, and accepted the exciting role as Olivia Records' official historian and archivist. Dr. Morris has been featured as a speaker at conferences and museums throughout the country and continues to profile women's music history for the Smithsonian. As a fiction writer, she also published the time travel novel Sappho's Bar and Grill, a finalist for the Forward National Award in LGBT fiction, and a winner of the Devil's Kitchen Award from Southern Illinois University. And coming soon, a history of women's sports entitled What's the Score? Dr. Bonnie Morris, the floor is yours.
Hi, well, my goodness. Thank you so much, my esteemed co-panelists. Wow. Here I am with your wisdom. I hope one day to return to DC as a Wilson Fellow. It's an honor to be here. I'm somebody who came out as a teenager. I've been out for more than 40 years. And when I came out in 1980, I had the benefit of a complete lesbian feminist subculture ready and waiting for me. There were concerts, presses, publishers, record companies, women's bookstores in every city. It was a very unique time. And what's crucial to remember for my historical narrative is while the 80s were devastating for gay men with the AIDS pandemic, they also were different for lesbians in terms of a kind of cultural blossoming of autonomous institutions. So there was no monolithic LGBT in my coming out experience. At the same time, I was aware from the minute I came out that even though I had little schooling in LGBT history, what I knew from my own experiences made me one day more learned than the people I was coming out to. And I understood from the word go, I was going to be a little diplomat from Dykeland, and that was a very unique role to put other people at ease with my choice, my sexuality, my path, and that I was the right person for that work because I didn't look stereotypically scary, and I tend to be cheerful and even-tempered and happy to be kind of a resource, if you will. So I was already on television defending gay rights at 19, and that was the first time I encountered academic homophobia. I was at that time a Jewish history major at American University in DC, and after I appeared on the Charlie Rose show, I had a student friend who was on his way to being a rabbi. Stop me in the hall and tell me that I was immoral and in need of psychiatric help, that he had seen me on television, that I was a disgrace. So I was fairly stoic about that. I understood, though, at the same time, that I was probably going to have two different resumes, one of which contained my activism as a lesbian and my early publishing, and the other my professional academic pathway. And this continued for quite a while. I actually ended up changing my focus from Jewish history to women's history. I became very concerned with the oppression of women as a guiding force in my work and a centering of my writing, and that I was also going to have ongoing struggles with Judaica, both geopolitically in terms of Middle East conflict and the moral test of my status as a lesbian. So off I went to grad school in women's history, where virtually all of my friends were lesbians. And though we were the best and the brightest, there was no lesbian history that was really taught to us in a serious way. Again, our lives were compartmentalized. So basically developed two brains. I had my coursework, my scholarship, my professional development, and then on the side, I ran around remedially educating myself on gay history and participating in presentations, conferences, and more or less the performing arts in terms of lesbian production and mentoring. I didn't have any out lesbian professors for a very long time. I was always out in my classes. I was never in the closet, and very proud of that. I experienced much more challenge as a woman than as a lesbian in terms of the pushback against women's history as a subject being introduced in schools. That came all the way from, you know, the federal government, from churches, from everybody who had an opinion that it was an agenda and not an area of study. But then once I began teaching, as indicated in this discussion, I have pretty much been a professional adjunct. I had a half-time appointment at Georgetown and a half-time appointment at George Washington University for almost 25 years. And put together, that was a very decent living, but it had its challenges. Although people stereotype women's studies and women's history as being overwhelmed with lesbian scholars, that wasn't necessarily so. And one of the things I was surprised by at GW was we didn't really have any classes on lesbian history, and I offered to design and teach one. And I was very grateful to be given that opportunity. At Georgetown, my career there spanned the entire arc from Georgetown banning gatherings of gay people to having one of the best LGBT centers in the country with a lavender graduation that's famous. And like Chloe, I was very well treated there. I never had any kind of overt homophobia from students or faculty. More that I felt that I was able to be more out and be more daring because I wasn't tenure track and I didn't have the specific Catholic background that gave a certain amount of sorrow to those who dealt with church homophobia explicitly. I found that one of the challenges I experienced as a resident of the District of Columbia was running into my own students in bars and clubs and them going, "Oh my God, my professor's here." And I was like, "No, wrong, flip that, my student's here. Who lives here permanently? You're here for 4 years, okay? So we're both here, we see each other, but you can't come on to me in the bar. That would make me very uncomfortable and I would have to leave. And that shouldn't happen to me in my own city. If you have a problem where you drink too much and you flirt with the professor, you leave, you go home." And I developed a means of having to deal with the off-campus life, which is very vibrant in Washington, but occasionally resulted in these kinds of conversations. You know, how open are you with your own students? Do you go with them to gay events? To what degree do you make resources available to them? Is that unethical? Is that the correct path? So I wrestled with that for years. Academically, I was surprised to find many of my students turning in papers saying there was nobody out on TV before Ellen. Wrong, wrong, wrong. So I used my own life experience of having lived through, everything that happened. From the shifting representation of gay people on television and government and entertainment to the changing laws. I was very open with my students at Georgetown in particular, that while I might be the person who could give them an A or an A minus, there being no other grade, right? They were the ones who could vote me out of US citizenship. And I made that clear in the era when we were felons, before sodomy laws were challenged by Lawrence versus Texas. And I pointed out to them that I could walk right across Key Bridge and I would be a felon in the state of Virginia. Then I could walk right back into Georgetown, and I had certain rights in DC, but not necessarily at Georgetown. Then I could walk back across the bridge into Virginia, and I was a felon. Then back into DC, and you see how it goes. So I made my life as a gay American, as a lesbian American, open for a classroom lesson from the word go. And that was very well received. It was a pleasure, oddly, to see the students take that in and be moved by what their own professor might deal with in terms of insecurity as a citizen of the same country. A couple other things, and then I'll stop. I think it's important to point out that in my professional development, I was out in 2 other places where I've had a long and excellent relationship. One is Semester at Sea. I was a 3-time faculty on board the shipboard program that takes students around the world to 12 countries. I was pretty much the only out faculty member the first time I went on Semester at Sea in '93. And we went to many countries where it was illegal to be homosexual and there was a death penalty. I had a lot of support, but what was most moving was that the next time I taught on Semester at Sea, they had a gay-straight alliance. There was more women's history. There was more open support. And then the third time, half the faculty were gay. So was the dean's daughter. It was just fantastic. And it was like it had never been an issue at all. But I lived through the development of that change. Likewise, I score AP US history exams for the College Board. When I started scoring with the AP, I was the only out lesbian among 1,000 scholars. And then I met more, and by being out and wearing rainbow everything, I developed a circle of friends, and they developed a circle of friends, and now there's much more support there too. So I lived my dream of being the diplomat, and though it hasn't been easy, I am now about to teach lesbian history at Berkeley, and I'm very proud of that.
Well, thank you so much. And we're proud of that too, it being Pride Month and also Pride Year, whatever, we can just take it all. But so now we'll move to the discussion portion. And Bonnie, I'm just going to bounce off something that you just were talking about being so visible and how important that is to you. And I was just wondering, you're here in this panel, so it obviously means that you do believe that these discussions are important. But why do you feel like having these discussions about queer inclusion and teaching exactly that class is something that, you know, research institutions should be taking seriously and should be investing their time in?
Wow. I believe that something that Alex Chee said when we had our little dress rehearsal struck a bell in me. Alex, you said that there was a time when you were out on your resume. And for me, a very dramatic change was the year, I believe, I want to say 1991, when I combined my 2 resumes, the scholarly one and the one that had all of my gay writing. And I realized I had been more productive and had published more in terms of gay activism, and that I would never have understood how productive I was if I had not dared to integrate my life. I think institutions need to see the exhausting productivity of people who have been advocates for their own community, as well as whatever else their major interest in, and that kind of person is exactly who they want on board, somebody who has had to have double the energy, double the commitment, double the fearlessness. And you might not know that that's the candidate for inclusion unless that person is able to offer an integrated resume freely and without fear. How you create an environment where people can approach you fearlessly and show you all that they are, that burden is on institutions to create that mood, and then beyond that outreach.
Right. And yes, Alex, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I would just add to that, you know, I was out on my resume from the beginning because I realized when I was making it that it would look like I had done nothing if I wasn't. It would look like I had published nothing, like I'd had no jobs in particular, because all of my jobs after college, like I worked for Different Light Books, which is an LGBT bookstore in the Castro in San Francisco. I interned at Outlook, which was a queer academic journal, and they also published my first published essay, a cover story. I had successes that I would have had to effectively closet as well as myself, and would make me look like someone who had just been, I don't know, who knows what, in between, like when I graduated college and when I, even after leaving graduate school, my first published memoir was in the anthology Boys Like Us, which was gay men writing about their coming out stories. It was an important credit. I was in there with authors like Eben White and Dale Peck and John Weir. I would have been waiting a long time for when I was eventually published in a straight publication. Actually, I'm trying to think of when that was. I think it was sometime. It was maybe a New York Times credit sometime in the late 90s. So that's bad, you know. It would have been bad for me. So I just decided not to do that. That I would either show them that I had had this this career or not.
Chloe, do you have anything to add?
Only a matter of intensity. I think for, you know, when a trans person comes out, when you transition, everything changes, absolutely everything. All of your past resume and all of those writing you've done and all of the projects had Stephen Schwenke on them. And, you know, you can't sort of just come back and erase. You have to own it. You have to own the fact that you have transitioned. It's right in your face. You know, I transitioned in 2008 and people knew nothing about trans issues then. And people were very unsettled by it. And there was a lot of questions amongst very well-educated people, supposedly, that this was a mental disorder, that, you know, even the, you know, your foundational sense of being a person of integrity in the sense of intellectual integrity was questioned. You know, you were considered as mentally incompetent by a lot of people. And there's just a lot of a great degree of unsettledness around trans women, particularly among cisgender men of a particular generation. This is not a comfortable space. And yet they don't even have the words to articulate why it's uncomfortable for them. So yeah, it was all right in my face immediately in 2008. You know, I just was about to publish my first book and told the publisher, hold the presses, this is going out as Chloe. Why did they push back? They didn't want that to happen. And they thought, well, you're going to change your mind. I said, you don't get to this stage. You know, you don't change your mind.
And Chloe, if I could bounce off that with a quick follow-up. So is, you know, navigating the conversations about your gender and your sexuality, is there a difference between the reception you got from students and faculty? Like a stark difference, or how has that gone for you?
Largely okay from the students. You know, I'm teaching at an Eastern university, you know, 2 Eastern universities that are both quite liberal. So I'm, you know, there's a pre-selection anyway that's in place. I have that sort of a lot of support and reassurance and solidarity. You know, they all know because I've written so much in trans spaces now, and I was, you know, a political appointee. There is no privacy anymore. I'm open about who I am and what I am. That's contrasted by the, you know, the level of hate mail I get all the time from the public, and that's a whole different world out there. And I have to coexist in these two worlds simultaneously, where I've got a supportive group of particularly students, faculty all over the place. Most of them would rather not talk about it. Basically, it's just not a topic they're conversationally comfortable with. They just avoid the conversation. I've had to be kind of in your face on, University of Maryland's DEI efforts caused some consternation there, but to their credit, they basically said, okay, well, let's give you some space. And they set up an event like this where I went on with an African-American gay man, and we had a really good conversation with the university about what inclusion meant beyond Black Lives Matter, to the point where you're dealing with other marginalized groups as well. And it was a good response from the university. But by and large, older men have a real issue with trans women, and that's a generalization that I don't have data for, but I can tell you anecdotally it's a problem. Women are much more comfortable with trans women. Again, a generalization, but that's been my experience.
And of course, only to compound it, that those older men and men of that generation are also at the top of many of these different institutions that we all are discussing today.
Bonnie, Alex, just a real quick note on that, and that is the fact that, you know, trans people experience unemployment and loss of employment at exponentially higher rates than cisgender people do. And that has everything to do with older white men being in charge of those kinds of functions. It's hopefully changing now. I've been fired 3 times in my career. And that's a huge problem. And it wasn't anything to do with anything about my performance. It was simply, and in many cases emphatically documented, that it was because it wasn't appropriate for a trans person to hold this job as far as they were concerned.
If I can jump in here, I want to acknowledge something that Chloe's brought up with, in reference to the tolerance we ascribe to Eastern universities or what have you. I think it's important in this panel that we mention there are still colleges and universities across the country that ban lesbian and gay and trans students and faculty, that while not stereotyping them all as evangelical Christian schools, many are by affiliation, private religious colleges that are permitted in their charters or whatever to discriminate based on whatever code of values they have. The reason that comes into my life is I have primarily taught women's sports history for the past 20 years or more. And I've worked with thousands of student athletes. Many of them are scheduled in conference against, say, Liberty University. They're playing a game against a school that would ban gay students and faculty. How do they feel warming up to go into that gym? I believe if a school scheduled a game in conference against a college that banned students of color, there would be far more tension and far more discussion. It is never discussed. And that's something that I just pounded the desk about. I felt that the fact that we accept that there are X number of schools where you have to sign a statement pledging that you are not an active homosexual as a condition for employment. That used to be true for the US military. So it's not that long ago that was also part of the State Department too. It lingers in terms of where student athletes interact with each other. That's part of an environment in terms of my role in sports studies that I feel needs a little more discussion. Because I feel it does impact the way that the LGBT athlete feels on game day against an opponent that really is an opponent. And what about the closeted kids playing on that other team? So within the academic world, surprisingly, there's a lot of athletic homophobia that's an interesting part of this discussion.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and a really great perspective that we haven't touched on yet. I know that we only have 6 more minutes, and I would be remiss not to mention, just because I do think it's important, Alex, when we're talking about these issues and nuances, you obviously occupy an intersectional space. And I was wondering if you could speak on how the layered experience about being a person of color and queer in academia might, change things to a point where you'd like to communicate something to your white colleagues within that layering, if you feel comfortable speaking on it. And you're on mute, sorry.
So something that I feel like is, I mean, in the end, that I've just sort of cooperated with it, but I know a lot of people who don't, and who shouldn't feel they have to. But it's this kind of, one of the things I'm thinking about is a search, was a targeted search, where I was being asked for syllabi that were not a part of my specialty, but that were related to my identity. So they were like, could you create an Asian American literature class? Could you create a gay literature class? So I did, because it was a targeted search and I wanted a job. And so I created a Asian American literature course that I've never taught. I created a gay literature course that I also have never taught. I think about those syllabi now because I am thinking about creating other courses now, and I have been, originally I was like, well, I am more a subject of Asian American studies than I am an expert in it. Like I had been to MLA conferences where Asian American literature scholars had come up and talked to me about my work and about how they were writing about me. And it was a huge honor to have those conversations and to be a subject of their attention and their critical eye. So it was a very strange place to be, and I ended up turning the job down, which was a very strange place to be in. I later heard that lots of people have had this experience. So I think I contrast that with, like, one of the opportunities that I helped create at Dartmouth recently that I'm very proud of was, we are starting to offer Asian American Studies courses that are creative writing courses, and I invited the trans Chinese American poet Yin Yi to come and teach for us, and they were interested in offering an Asian American trans queer poetry class, and so they offered it, and everything that they read was that kind of writing. All the students were identified that way. It was a really powerful thing for them to create like a community space that way. And I had a wonderful note from Yin Yi afterwards, who was just sort of like really happy with the result, really wanting to do it again. And I'm looking to see how we can make that happen again. What sort of structural work needs to be done for that? Because we were filling a class there that created an opportunity that created something truly profound and original. So it's not that, I guess I should say, like, it's not that we don't want to do that kind of work if we do want to do that kind of work, which is, like, in some ways, like, I was inviting Yin Yi to teach, however they wanted to teach that class. They were offered another class as well. This was what they were excited about. It was sort of the inverse of the experience that I went through. And I think so much of the way it came out differently was how, like, I didn't feel like I was telling that I was putting Yin Yi in the same position I had been in, if that is understood. That instead I was like, here are these courses that we need filled. How would you like to approach them? These are some, it became a it came out of a conversation. So I guess I think so much of it is about who is being given power and how is the power being distributed in those scenarios. You know, they're not really, it's something where I guess we're all trying to figure out together.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you so much for sharing. And unfortunately, it is 2 p.m. Eastern time. And thank you so much to our guests. I know that we have to wrap it up because of concerns around AV and the live stream. But again, I can't thank you all enough. This has been an amazing conversation that I am just so excited will live on the Wilson Center website for ages to come. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone who watched at home. Be safe, and we will see you for our other Pride programming. Have a great one. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.